The billionaire froze in the doorway, his breath catching as the sound of laughter drifted through the hall. There, beneath the chandelier, his maid twirled barefoot, his deaf twins giggling as she spun. For a moment, the scene was pure light, unguarded and human. Then one of the twins pointed toward the window at the red light blinking there. A hidden camera. And in that instant, the warmth in Jonathan's chest turned to ice. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Night had settled on the house like a heavy velvet curtain, soft and complete. The city around Jonathan Clark's glass tower buzzed and flashed far below, but inside the house the air was quiet, almost sacred. Light from the pool threw slow ripples up against the white walls. A single lamp in the study burned with a tired, steady glow, and the rest of the room slept under a gentle hush. Jonathan woke to a dream he could not finish. In the dream, he was small again, standing on an empty stage with a spotlight that felt too bright. He tried to speak, but the words fell out of him like coins and scattered in the dark. He reached for them and could not pick them up. The dream left a bitter taste in his mouth, the kind that stayed when you woke, before understanding why you were sweating. He sat up and listened. In the stillness, he could hear the house breathing, faint pipes, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the clock that marked time with polite clicks. Tonight, those sounds felt like witnesses. Jonathan rubbed his hand over his face and looked at the photograph on his bedside table. It showed 3 small faces, his wife's laugh frozen mid-burst, and 2 children holding hands, their eyes full of a trust that felt almost like a dare. His chest tightened. The house around him had everything a man could buy and nothing he wanted to hold. Money had given him choices. Yes, but it had not given him forgiveness or sleep that stayed or answers to the questions that visited him in the night. He felt like a stranger in his own life, someone who moved from room to room, making decisions for people whose names he sometimes forgot to say aloud. A faint sound reached him from downstairs, a scrape, a soft laugh, the rustle of fabric. Music, too, very low at first, then clearer. An old jazz record he had heard once at a party years ago, the kind of music that made people remember summers they never lived through. The sound went through him with a strange tug, half memory, half promise. He stood and pulled on a sweater. The house was his fortress, but also a place of echoes. The doors were all closed by habit. Privacy was something he had bought, so often it had become a strange ritual. He walked down the stairs with quiet, careful steps. The marble felt cool beneath his feet. As he reached the landing, the music stopped. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. Then he saw them. By the living room window, where the light met the night, and everything looked like water, Grace was dancing with the twins. She moved with a softness that belied the hardness of the world. She had a small, steady joy that lived in the line of her shoulders and the way her feet found the floor. The twins, Michael and Sarah, were laughing without sound. Their hands beat a silent rhythm on their knees, their faces alight. They were not children of idle privilege. They were children of careful joy, the kind that comes from small victories. Learning a new sign, catching a single sunbeam on a winter morning, reading the shape of someone's mouth, and knowing what they meant. Grace's skin glowed in the lamplight. She wore a room-worn dress, the kind that had known long days, hands at work, nights of careful cleaning and quiet sacrifices. She had been with them for 2 years now, steady as a worn rope. People like Grace lived in small corners of the house, but she had taught herself to carve out a world larger than the rooms allowed. She talked to the twins in soft signs and in a voice that trembled sometimes with too much kindness. Jonathan had hired her because she was excellent at her work. He kept her because she was gentle with the children in a way he was not. He stood in the doorway and watched, feeling like an interloper. The sight of her, not hiding, not ashamed, simply loose and human, pulled at a place in him that had not been touched for years. There was something wild and honest in her movement, like wind through a cracked window. For a moment, he thought he would step forward and laugh with them, forgetting the careful control he wore like armor. But he stayed quiet because habit had taught him that interruptions were dangerous, and because there were secrets in his house he was not yet ready to test. Grace moved close to Michael and Sarah and bent down. She cupped her hands and signed something slowly, with care. The twins signed back, fingers flying with the speed of their small excitement. Jonathan had watched these exchanges before, the gentle, private language that opened doors only for those who lived inside. It was intimate. It was real. It also made him feel distant, as if he were on the other side of a window looking in. For a while, he stood there measuring the distance between what he could buy and what he could touch. His life had been built by decisions. Deals, meetings, numbers that blinked green or red. He had learned to trust numbers because people were unpredictable. But the sight in front of him, Grace making tiny mistakes in a dance, the twins shaping silent laughter into a conversation, was not something numbers could very well care for. A smell drifted to him, cinnamon and orange, the kitchen left warm from afternoon tea. He remembered a conversation with his lawyer about custody and schedules, the cold algebra of it. They had argued about best interests and stability until he learned to say the phrases without feeling his throat close. Numbers had told him when to be present and when to be absent. The twins' presence in his life had been scheduled like an appointment. He closed his eyes, and a memory rose unbidden, a hospital room years before the beeping monitors, his wife's hand small on his own. He had promised once, in a voice dry with fear, to protect them. The promise had felt like a lifeline then. Over time, protection had become provision, money, private tutors, therapists, worlds made to order. He told himself he had kept his promise. The sight of Grace dancing with the twins made him wonder what he had missed while keeping score. He stepped forward before he could stop himself. The twins saw him and their whole faces changed, the way light shifts off water. Michael signed excitedly to Sarah, fingers flicking fast, and Sarah's smile grew wider. Grace turned, and for a moment the air sharpened. She did not look surprised. In that house, people were always coming and going. But her eyes met his and held something steady, not exactly deference, not exactly fear and awareness. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice low and even, careful of the late hour. "No," he said. His voice sounded older than he felt. He could have lied, said he worked, said he had been restless with numbers, but the truth sat easily between them. He had not been able to name the ache that pulled at him lately. Sometimes that ache came from regret, sometimes from the sense that something was about to change. Grace wiped her palms on her dress and stood. "They liked the music," she said, and her smile was small and real. "We were practicing signs to autumn leaves." "Autumn leaves," he repeated, as if saying the words would anchor them. He moved closer and sat in the chair near the window. The twins climbed onto the rug and curled into themselves like two small shells. They tapped their hands on their legs again, the movement like a secret drum. Jonathan watched and thought of permission and ownership. He had learned to own things that glittered. People had told him the cost of being unbending. A quiet house, children who measured affection in footsteps, friends who became business cards. Now, in the hush, he felt the weight of those choices pressing into the floorboards. "You're late tonight," he said, finally, not a question. Grace's eyes flicked to the clock. "I stayed," she said. "They asked me to." The way she said it made him hear more than the words. He was not sure if he liked the sound. For the first time in a long while, he felt something like worry that had nothing to do with money. He was beginning to understand that losing control did not always mean losing power. Sometimes it meant losing illusions. Outside, The night pulsed on, unaware. Inside, something small and significant had shifted, a private scene of music and motion that he had not planned for. He sat there, hands folded, and watched Grace teach the twins the shape of a new sign. He realized with a strange and sudden clarity that the house had more life in it than he had expected, that life was not his creation alone. It moved without his permission, and it reminded him that decisions belonged to many hands, not just his. The next morning broke with a deceptive calm, a soft, golden light spilling through the wide windows, painting everything in quiet serenity. The house looked peaceful, like a photograph, still, curated and untouched. Yet beneath that calm, something trembled, a tension so faint that only a man like Jonathan, trained to sense shifts in markets and people, could feel it. He stood by the kitchen island, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the twins through the open glass doors. They were in the garden, sitting cross-legged on the grass, hands moving quickly as Grace knelt beside them. She was teaching them something again. Her fingers spoke in quick, fluid motions like birds mid-flight. Sarah tilted her head and frowned in concentration, while Michael laughed silently, signing something that made Grace grin. That small domestic peace, it should have been comforting. Instead, Jonathan felt a hollow unease settle behind his ribs. The image from last night still lingered. Grace dancing, her movements tender and alive in a house that had long forgotten laughter. He'd stood there too long, watching her move with a freedom he couldn't understand. Now, as the twins laughed and signed under her care, he wondered when exactly his home had started belonging more to her presence than his own. He set down the cup and walked to his study, the echo of his footsteps following him like a quiet accusation. The study smelled faintly of cedar and ink. On the desk, the morning mail sat neatly arranged, bills, invitations, reports, and on top of them, a white envelope with no return address. He frowned. His assistant never left unverified mail on his personal desk. He picked it up. His name was written in looping, delicate handwriting, almost elegant, but with a slight tremor in the letters, as if written by someone nervous or hurried. He slit the envelope open and pulled out a single folded sheet. No greeting, no signature, just a short message, typed this time, not handwritten. You think you know what happens when you're not home. You don't. Ask your maid about the night you were in Dubai. Jonathan froze. His first instinct was disbelief, a flare of irritation that anyone would dare send something so childish. But the words had a strange gravity. They were specific, personal, and deliberate. Dubai. That had been 3 months ago, a quick 3-day trip to finalize a merger, something routine. He had left the twins with Grace because they trusted her, because she had never given him reason to doubt her. And yet, he found himself reading the note again. The phrasing didn't sound like gossip. It sounded like a warning. He folded it once more, slower this time, and placed it on the desk. He didn't like how his hands felt, tense, clumsy, unsure. He'd built a career on reading people, understanding motives behind polite smiles and strategic silences. But Grace? She wasn't someone he'd ever tried to read. He had just accepted her in the quiet, grateful way people accept kindness they can't quite repay. Still, the letter had done its work. Doubt had entered the room. A knock came at the door. Grace's voice followed, soft but steady. Mr. Clark? Breakfast is ready. He slid the letter under a stack of papers and said, Come in. Grace opened the door, sunlight tracing her silhouette. She wore the same modest uniform, pale blue dress, apron tied neatly. There was something serene about her. Yet now, in his new lens of suspicion, he saw too much composure, too much care in how she met his gaze. The twins are asking if they can have breakfast in the garden, she said. He nodded. Let them. I'll join in a bit. She hesitated. Would you like your coffee refilled, sir? He glanced at the cup, half empty. No, thank you. She nodded again, and he could feel her studying him for a second longer than usual, as if she sensed something different in him. Then she left, her footsteps quiet against the hardwood. When she was gone, Jonathan exhaled slowly. The moment stretched. Outside, he could hear the twins laughing again, pure, unguarded joy. It should have eased him, but instead it made the letter's words dig deeper. Ask your maid about the night you were in Dubai. The more he thought about it, the more his mind began building possibilities, scenarios, half-truths, unspoken things. He remembered the twins had seemed unusually tired when he returned from that trip. Grace had brushed it off, saying they'd had trouble sleeping. At the time, he hadn't questioned it. Now, he found himself wondering what else she'd brushed off with that same calm tone. He left the study and stepped outside. The sunlight was warm against his face. Grace was helping Sarah fasten her shoe, while Michael signed something Jonathan couldn't understand. She laughed again, not loudly, just enough that it felt like real laughter, not the kind you give your employer out of courtesy. He wanted to shake the unease off. But his mind, trained to detect patterns and inconsistencies, wouldn't stop working. He noticed small details, how Grace's wrist bore a faint mark, as though from something recently removed. How she avoided holding his gaze now, instead keeping her attention on the twins. He decided to test her. "Grace," he called, "I'll need you to stay late tonight. There's a guest coming, someone from the foundation." Her hands paused mid-sign. "Of course, sir. What time?" 8. He smiled faintly. "And Grace?" She looked up. "Yes." He studied her face, not harshly, but with that quiet, assessing look that had unnerved CEOs and politicians alike. "When I was in Dubai, everything went smoothly here?" She blinked. "Yes, sir. The children were fine." "Any visitors?" he asked too casually. Her answer came without a breath's delay. "No one, sir." The calmness in her voice should have settled him, but it didn't. It was too smooth, like water that hides what's beneath. That night, after the twins went to bed and the house returned to silence, Jonathan found himself drawn back to his study. The letter was still there, half buried under papers. He unfolded it again. The words stared back, colder now. He poured himself a drink. Scotch neat. The amber liquid burned down his throat, a comfort that no longer comforted. He leaned back, eyes tracing the ceiling, and let his thoughts drift. What if the letter was meant to manipulate him? A business rival, an envious employee, or worse, someone inside the house? The staff knew his schedule. They knew Grace's. They knew how much the twins adored her. Whoever wrote this wanted him to look at Grace differently, and they were succeeding. He set the glass down. Through the open study door, he heard a faint sound, a creak, a whisper of fabric. He rose quietly, stepping into the hallway. The light from the children's room spilled out faintly, a soft yellow glow. He approached and paused at the doorframe. Inside, Grace sat on the edge of Sarah's bed, gently brushing the little girl's hair with slow strokes. Sarah's eyes were half closed, her small hand resting against Grace's arm. Grace was humming something under her breath, a lullaby. Her voice was fragile, almost breaking. There was no deceit there, no hidden motive he could detect, only exhaustion and tenderness. He should have felt reassured, but instead, he noticed something on the nightstand, a small locket, silver, old, engraved with initials he didn't recognize. Not his wife's, not his children. He'd never seen it before. Grace followed his gaze and froze for just a fraction of a second, enough for him to notice. "Beautiful piece," he said quietly. "Is it yours?" Her lips parted, but she didn't answer immediately. Then she nodded. "Yes, it was a gift from someone I used to know." Something in her tone, something fragile and unfinished, tightened his chest. He smiled faintly and nodded. "Good night, Grace." When he turned away, he didn't see her shoulders tense or the tear that slipped quietly down her cheek as she whispered to the sleeping child. Outside the room, Jonathan walked back to his study and closed the door behind him. The letter lay open on his desk once more beside the untouched glass of scotch. He read the words again. Ask your maid about the night you were in Dubai. This time, he whispered to the empty room, I will. And somewhere deep down beneath suspicion and fear, something else stirred, a dangerous curiosity he couldn't yet name. The days that followed carried an unfamiliar weight, as though the house itself had learned to hold its breath. Nothing outwardly changed, and yet everything felt different. The music in the mornings, the laughter of the twins, even Grace's quiet footsteps on the marble floors. All of it carried a new undertone, one Jonathan couldn't unhear now that suspicion had taken root. He had always thought of himself as a man of reason, of proof, of clean numbers and visible evidence. But doubt didn't work that way. It wasn't loud. It crept, soft, invisible, and persistent. On the surface, he treated Grace no differently. He spoke with the same distant politeness, issued the same calm instructions. Yet his eyes began to follow her in small, unspoken ways. He noticed what time she came in, when she left, the tiny moments she lingered in the twins' rooms before going home. He told himself it was nothing, but part of him catalogued every glance, every pause, and Grace felt it. She had worked long enough in other people's homes to know when she was being watched. The difference was subtle in how Jonathan's voice hesitated before asking a question, in how his eyes lingered a second too long on her hands. She said nothing, but inside she began to carry a familiar ache, the kind born from knowing trust can dissolve without ever being discussed. One evening after putting the twins to bed, she found him sitting by the piano in the living room. The keys were untouched, but a glass of whiskey sat beside the instrument, half empty. The man who'd once filled this house with decisions now looked smaller, folded inward like a question unanswered. You play, she asked softly. He didn't look up. Not anymore. You used to? A faint smile crossed his face. My wife did. She tried to teach me once, but I have no rhythm. Grace sat across from him, not too close, but near enough that the distance between them could be felt. Maybe it's not rhythm, she said quietly. Maybe it's just timing. Jonathan turned to her then, and their eyes met. It was a simple exchange, but it unsettled him. There was something in her gaze, a quiet knowing that didn't belong to a maid. How long have you worked here now? He asked. 2 years, she said. Almost. And before that, Grace hesitated. Another house. In Virginia. But it didn't end well. He leaned back slightly. Why? She looked at the floor, fingers twisting the hem of her apron. People like me don't get to explain why much, sir. We just leave when we're told to. Her voice was calm, but her eyes glimmered with something sharper, resentment maybe, or grief. Jonathan felt the edges of his assumptions soften. He wanted to ask more, but she rose, her composure returning like a practiced mask. I should go, sir. It starts early tomorrow. He watched her walk away, her steps soundless, and for reasons he couldn't name, he felt guilty, though he wasn't sure for what. Later that night, when the house had gone still, Jonathan sat again at his desk. The letter from the unknown sender remained hidden beneath his papers, but it haunted him. Ask your maid about the night you were in Dubai. He poured another drink and stared at his reflection in the dark glass window. His own face looked foreign, like a man rehearsing someone else's life. He thought about Grace's calm voice, the twins' laughter, and that locket with initials he didn't recognize. Curiosity burned hotter than doubt now. The next day, he called his private investigator, someone he'd used discreetly for business rivals. He asked, in the most casual tone he could muster, to run a quiet check on Grace Ellis. Age, background, prior employment, any red flags. He hung up before he could change his mind. Hours later, he found himself watching her again. She was in the garden with the twins, teaching them how to plant herbs in small clay pots. Sarah signed something quickly, and Grace laughed, not a servant's polite laugh, but a sound full of life. Michael dropped a handful of soil, and she bent to help him, her hand brushing his gently. Jonathan felt something twist inside him, part admiration, part discomfort. She belonged in their world in a way he no longer did. The twins listened to her, trusted her, and loved her. When they smiled at her, it was with unguarded affection, something they rarely gave him anymore. He stayed by the window long after the scene ended, a strange loneliness gnawing quietly beneath his ribs. That evening, Grace noticed the twins were quieter than usual during dinner. Sarah's eyes darted toward her father, then to Grace, then back again. Grace smiled gently. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Sarah hesitated, then signed something quickly to Michael. He signed back, both glancing at Jonathan. Grace's heart tugged. "You can tell me, it's all right." Sarah finally pointed at her father and signed again, slower this time. Grace's expression softened. Grace looked up at Jonathan. "She says you look sad today." Jonathan blinked. "Sad?" Grace nodded. "They notice, even if they can't hear." His gaze softened, the business mask slipping for a moment. "I'm fine," he said, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. Sarah reached out and touched his wrist, her small hand light as breath. Jonathan covered it with his own, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled, not the distant smile of obligation, but something smaller, realer. Grace felt a warmth stir inside her, followed almost immediately by fear. Because that moment, that fragile human connection, was precisely what people like her were never supposed to have in houses like this. 2 days later, Jonathan's phone rang. It was his investigator. "Found something," the man said. "Grace Ellis isn't her birth name." Jonathan's blood went cold. "Go on." "My real name's Grace Whitaker. I changed it about 3 years ago. Before that, she worked for a family in Virginia. Left abruptly after an incident." "What kind of incident?" The line crackled. "Their youngest son went missing for a night. Found safe the next morning, unharmed, but the police were involved. Grace wasn't charged, but she quit right after. The family didn't press." Jonathan's hand tightened around the phone. "And the initials on her locket? GW Grace Whitaker. Matches perfectly." He ended the call, slowly, mind-whirring. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. He stared at the closed door, behind which the twins were laughing softly with Grace as she read them a bedtime story. Her voice carried faintly through the door, calm and warm. And yet, now that he knew, every gentle word sounded different. Every smile seemed to hide something. Was the letter writer trying to protect him or manipulate him? He didn't know. But one thing had become clear. Grace had secrets, and he was about to find out exactly what they were. That night, long after the house fell silent, Jonathan stood outside Grace's small room near the servants' quarters. The door was slightly ajar. A faint glow spilled out, the golden pulse of a lamp. He could hear her voice, low and trembling. At first, he thought she was on the phone, but then he realized she was praying. "Please," she whispered, "don't let it happen again. Not here. Not to them." Jonathan froze. Not here. Not to them. Her words hit him like a stone through glass. What had happened before? He turned away, quietly, the floorboards groaning beneath his step. Inside the room, Grace pressed her hands together and kept whispering, unaware that just beyond the wall, suspicion had already turned into something far more dangerous, a need for truth that would soon unravel everything she had tried to rebuild. The storm came without warning. By late afternoon, clouds rolled over the city like bruises spreading through the sky. The wind tore at the trees, scattering leaves across the lawn where the twins had been playing earlier. The air turned electric, charged, restless, heavy with something unsaid. Inside, Jonathan paced his study, the blinds half drawn, his thoughts pounding louder than the thunder outside. The report from his investigator sat open on his desk, pages littered with details he couldn't stop rereading. Grace Whitaker. Born in Georgia. I worked in Virginia. Left abruptly after the disappearance of a child, the youngest son of a Donovan family. No criminal record, no charges filed, but a pattern of silence around the event. The boy had vanished from his room one night and reappeared the next morning, unharmed but terrified. The only person on duty that night was the maid, Grace. Jonathan's mind gnawed on the edges of that story, filling in gaps with possibilities that frightened him more than he'd admit. And yet, something didn't fit. If Grace had done something truly wrong, why no record? Why hire her here? Lightning flashed outside, throwing his reflection against the glass, pale, sleepless, haunted. A soft knock pulled him for his thoughts. Grace stood in the doorway, rain already spotting her uniform. "Mr. Clark, the twins are frightened. The thunder." Her voice faltered when she saw the open file on his desk. Her eyes flicked to the pages, just once briefly, but enough for him to notice. "Close the door," he said quietly. She hesitated, then obeyed. Jonathan gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit." Grace didn't move. "Is something wrong, sir?" He leaned back, watching her the way a chess player watches his opponent before making the move that changes everything. "You tell me." "I don't understand." He tapped the papers on his desk. "You changed your name 3 years ago. Why?" For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe. The storm outside cracked, thunder shaking the window panes. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I had to. That's not an answer." Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "I didn't hurt anyone, Mr. Clark. Whatever you've been told." "I wasn't told," he interrupted, voice cold but even. "I found out. You could have been honest with me. I was trying to leave it behind," she said, finally looking him in the eye. "That life. That mistake." "What mistake?" Grace closed her eyes. The air between them thickened. When she spoke again, her words came slowly, deliberately. "The boy in Virginia. I wasn't supposed to be alone with him that night. His parents were fighting. He came to my room, crying. He said he wanted to run away, and before I could stop him, he was gone. I found him near the lake the next morning." Her eyes glistened. "The police asked questions. His mother said I'd let him leave on purpose. The family didn't press charges. They just made sure I disappeared, quietly. A new name was the only way to start again." Jonathan wanted to believe her. But the letter, that single poisonous message, still whispered in his mind. "You think you know what happens when you're not home. And you never thought to tell me?" he asked. "You would have never hired me if I had," she said simply. "I needed this job. I needed them." "The twins." She nodded. "They remind me of that boy. The way he laughed, the way he used to talk with his hands. I swear to you, I would never hurt your children." Her voice cracked at the end, and Jonathan looked at her, really looked at her. The fear in her eyes wasn't guilt. It was something deeper, the terror of losing a second chance. He opened his mouth to respond, but another sound cut through the storm. A sharp crash from upstairs, followed by Michael's scream. Jonathan bolted from the chair. "Stay here." But Grace was already running past him. They reached the twins' room together. The window had blown open, rain pouring in, curtains whipping violently. Sarah was on the bed, crying silently, her little hands trembling as she tried to sign through her panic. Michael stood by the dresser, his hand bleeding where he'd knocked over a glass frame. Grace rushed to him first, wrapping his hand in a towel. It's okay," she mouthed, her voice soothing and steady. Jonathan turned to the window, slammed it shut, then knelt beside Sarah, pulling her close. His pulse hammered in his ears. "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe." The storm outside began to fade, but inside the room, the air stayed charged. When Grace finished bandaging Michael's hand, she stood, soaked, pale, shaking. "They're fine," she said softly. "Just frightened." Jonathan looked at her again, his anger dulled by adrenaline and confusion. She looked too fragile, too human to be the woman from his fears. And yet, something inside him still whispered, "Don't trust her." Later that night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Jonathan went back to the study. Grace had gone to change, leaving her phone on the counter in the hallway. It buzzed once, a new message lighting up the screen. He shouldn't have looked, but he did. The message was from an unknown number. Did he ask about Dubai yet? Jonathan froze. The world seemed to narrow, sound dropping away. Another message appeared seconds later. "Remember what you owe me. Don't ruin this." He stared at the glowing screen, his thoughts tumbling into chaos. The words burned into his mind, feeding every suspicion that had been growing inside him. He heard Grace's footsteps approaching and quickly stepped back. She appeared at the end of the hall, hair damp, eyes tired. She reached for her phone, unaware he'd seen the messages. "Good night, Mr. Clark," she said quietly. "Good night," he replied, his voice steady, his pulse anything but. When she disappeared down the hall, he stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she'd been. His chest felt tight, like he'd swallowed air that wouldn't settle. So, the letter had been right. There was something about that night in Dubai, and she was in contact with someone who knew about it. But what could she possibly owe? And to whom? He walked back to his study, the storm still flickering faintly beyond the windows, and poured himself another drink. Grace's soft laugh from earlier echoed in his memory, twisted now by suspicion. He had once thought of her as the calm center of his house, a quiet, dependable presence. Now, she was something else entirely, a mystery he could no longer ignore, a lie wrapped in gentleness. He lifted the glass, staring at the amber liquid. The reflection of the stormlight shimmered in it, chaotic, beautiful, dangerous. In that moment, Jonathan understood one thing with absolute clarity. Grace wasn't the woman he thought she was. And whatever happened in Dubai, whatever secret she was guarding, it wasn't just about the past. It was about him. The rain had stopped by morning, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm. Jonathan stood by the window, watching droplets slide down the glass in thin, crooked lines. The city beyond was blurred, like a painting smudged by grief. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the same two messages replayed in his mind. Did he ask about Dubai yet? And remember what you owe me. He couldn't shake the words. They crawled through his thoughts like parasites, attaching themselves to everything. Grace's smile at breakfast, the twins' laughter in the garden, the way she folded his son's blanket with care. It all looked normal. Too normal. At 9 a.m., Grace knocked on the study door. "Breakfast is ready, sir." Jonathan didn't turn. "I'm not hungry." She hesitated. "The twins are asking for you." He exhaled slowly, forcing his voice steady. "Tell them I'll be down soon." When she left, he pulled out his phone and typed a message to Mark, his oldest friend, now a lawyer at a private intelligence firm. "Need you to look into someone. Discreetly. Name, Grace Whitaker, alias. Might be tied to something from Dubai 2021. He hit send, then slid the phone away and tried to breathe normally. Downstairs, Grace moved like a ghost. She spoke softly to the twins, smiled when they spoke, but her eyes were far away. Sarah tried signing something to her, something Jonathan didn't quite catch, and Grace's hands stilled mid-motion. "I'll tell him later," she said quietly, though no one had asked what she meant. Jonathan watched her from the staircase. The way she tucked Sarah's hair behind her ear, the way her fingers lingered for a second too long, there was warmth there. Genuine warmth. And that only made things worse. He couldn't hate her, not fully. But he couldn't trust her either. By afternoon, Mark called. "Grace Whitaker, huh? That name doesn't exist before 2022, Mark said. But here's where it gets strange. There's a record of a passport issued under that name, paid for by a company called Althera Holdings." Jonathan frowned. "Never heard of them." "You wouldn't. They're a shell, based in Dubai, connected to a security firm that got caught laundering money through offshore accounts. The kind of people who don't issue passports for fun. Jonathan's hand tightened on the phone. So, she didn't just change her name to escape her past. Looks like someone gave her that past. Mark paused. Listen, John, whatever she's caught up in, it's big. You need to be careful. Don't confront her yet. But Jonathan already knew he would. That night, Grace found him in the study again. You've barely eaten, she said, voice low, cautious. I'm not hungry, he replied, without looking up. She lingered by the doorway. The twins asked why you don't talk to me anymore. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the faint tremor in her hands. Maybe because I don't know who I'm talking to. Her lips parted slightly. You found out. I found enough, he said. Althera Holdings, Dubai, and those messages on your phone. For a second, she looked like she might run. But then she did something he didn't expect. She closed the door and stepped closer. Please, she whispered. You don't understand. Then make me. Her breath shook. 2 years ago, in Dubai, there was an accident, a fire at a construction site your company funded. The press called it an electrical fault, but it wasn't. Someone cut the wires deliberately. 3 men died. Jonathan, he went still. How do you know that? Because one of them was my brother. The words hung in the air like ash. Grace's voice trembled. He was working night security. He called me just before it happened, said someone was covering up the safety violations. After the fire, the company paid off the families to stay quiet. I went to Dubai to find out who signed those payments. Jonathan swallowed hard. His mind flashed back to the night of that fire, his inbox flooded with reports, his lawyers urging him to stay silent. He'd done what he always did, distance himself, let others handle it. Your name was on the approval papers, Grace continued, tears streaking her cheeks. But I knew it couldn't be that simple. I thought if I worked here, I'd find proof that someone forged your authorization, that you weren't the one responsible. Jonathan stared at her, his pulse hammering. So, you lied your way into my home? I didn't come here to hurt you, she said, voice breaking. I came to uncover the truth. But then, I saw you with your children. I saw who you really are. And I couldn't keep going. I was going to tell you everything, but then someone found out I'd come too close. Who? The same people who paid for my passport. They sent that message last night, the one you saw. Jonathan's jaw clenched. And what do they want? She looked down. They want me to find proof that you destroyed evidence. Or they'll come after the twins. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan's world shifted beneath him. Guilt, fear, betrayal all folding into one unbearable weight. You should have told me sooner, he said finally. I was trying to protect you, she whispered. Protect me? His voice rose. You lied, manipulated your way into my life, and now you're telling me you did it for me? Tears spilled freely now. You don't understand. I thought you were part of it. But when I saw the way you held your daughter, the way you talked to them, I knew you couldn't be that man. He turned away, breathing hard. I don't even know what to believe anymore. Grace took a hesitant step closer. Then believe this, they're watching you. They've been watching all of us since the day I arrived. Jonathan froze. What do you mean? Cameras. Hidden in the study, the nursery, even the backyard. They installed them when the security system was upgraded last month. He felt the air leave his lungs. That upgrade, the one he'd approved without question. Grace pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. I found one behind the bookshelf this morning. There's footage, encrypted, but I copied what I could. Jonathan took the drive, his fingers trembling. What's on it? Her voice cracked. I think it's you. Talking on the phone, the night of the fire. He stared at her, heart thundering. If what she said was true, then someone wasn't just threatening him. They were rewriting his past, piece by piece, until even he couldn't tell what was real. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows like restless fingers. Jonathan met her eyes, both of them caught between fear and something else neither dared name. You've dragged me into something I can't escape, he said quietly. Grace's reply came like a confession and a plea all at once. You were already in it, Jonathan. You just didn't know. The storm returned that night, louder, darker, alive. Thunder rolled over the mansion like a warning, shaking the chandeliers, rattling the walls. Jonathan stood in the study, the flash drive clenched in his fist, Grace beside him, pale and trembling. The faint blue glow of the laptop painted both their faces in cold light. On the screen, the footage began to play. The date in the corner read June 12th, 2021, the night of the Dubai fire. Jonathan's voice echoed through the room, faint through the recording. Make it disappear. I don't want any investigations tied to my name. Jonathan's stomach twisted. His own voice, calm, certain, unmistakable. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. You said you didn't know. I didn't, he interrupted, his voice sharp with disbelief. I never said that. That recording, he leaned closer, watching his own face on the screen. The video flickered slightly, the image grainy, distorted, like a bad memory reassembled from scraps. This isn't real. Then, who made it? Grace whispered. Before he could answer, the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. The entire house sank into darkness. The twins screamed from upstairs. Jonathan grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and switched it on. Stay here, he told Grace, his voice firm. But she grabbed his arm. Don't go alone. He hesitated, then nodded. Together they climbed the staircase, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. When they reached the nursery, both twins were huddled beneath the bed, their eyes wide. Jonathan knelt beside them, his heart pounding. It's okay, he whispered, pulling them close. Daddy's here. But when he turned, he saw it, a faint red light, blinking from the corner of the room. Grace gasped, There. He shone the flashlight upward. A small camera lens was embedded in the molding, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Jonathan yanked it out with a sharp twist, wires snapping loose, sparks hissing. Someone's watching us right now, Grace said, her voice trembling. Jonathan's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered. Who is this? A voice on the other end, low, smooth, unmistakably calm, spoke through a faint static hum. Mr. Hargrove, I see you found our little eyes. Jonathan's blood ran cold. What do you want? We want the same thing you do, the voice said, to protect your children, to keep your secrets safe. But you've made it complicated, bringing Grace into this. Jonathan's grip tightened on the phone. If you come near my family, I'll... The voice chuckled. You already did, Jonathan. 3 years ago, when you signed that approval. Your signature killed 3 men. That's a lie. Maybe, but lies are what people remember. The line went dead. Jonathan's heart thundered in his chest. Grace stood frozen, the twins clinging to her. The rain outside hammered the windows like frantic knocks. Pack the kids' things, Jonathan said, his voice low but resolute. We're leaving. Grace hesitated. Where will we go? Somewhere they can't follow. But as they turned to leave, the study door downstairs slammed shut, hard. Footsteps echoed up the stairs, slow and deliberate. Grace's breath caught. They're here. Jonathan handed her the flashlight and reached for the metal poker by the fireplace. Every creak in the old house felt magnified, the shadows shifting as if alive. The footsteps stopped outside the nursery door. Silence. Then a click. The door opened. It wasn't who he expected. Mark, soaked from the rain, his coat clinging to him, his expression unreadable. Mark, Jonathan breathed. What the hell are you doing here? Mark's eyes flicked to Grace, then to the twins. You shouldn't have gone digging, John. Jonathan stepped forward. It was you. Mark sighed, almost pitying. You were supposed to stay quiet like before. Let the lawyers clean it up. But you had to play the hero. Jonathan's voice shook. You set me up. You forged that recording. I didn't forget anything. I just made sure the right people saw what they needed to. Grace's voice trembled. You killed my brother. Mark's expression hardened. Collateral damage. He shouldn't have been there. Jonathan lunged, slamming Mark against the wall. The poker pressed his throat. You destroyed everything for me. Mark didn't flinch. You destroyed it yourself, John. You just never had the courage to look. The twins began to cry. Grace shouted, Jonathan, stop. But something inside him snapped, years of buried guilt, betrayal, and blindness boiling to the surface. He wanted to make Mark feel what he had, the loss, the fear, the shame. Mark's voice rasped through clenched teeth. You know better than me. You built your empire on silence. Jonathan froze. Those words hit harder than any blow could. He released him. Mark stumbled forward, coughing. Grace stepped between them. Enough. This isn't justice. Jonathan dropped the poker, breathing hard. His voice broke. What do they want, Mark? Why come after my family? Mark straightened, wiping blood from his lip. Because the files, the originals, are hidden in your system. Grace got too close. They were afraid she'd find proof that you didn't sign those papers, that you were innocent. Grace's eyes widened. Then, yes, Mark said bitterly, you were right. Someone forged his signature. But if that comes out, they all burn, the investors, the board, the ones funding the next deal. They can't afford that. Jonathan felt the room spin. So you let them use my name. Let them ruin me. Mark's face twisted with something like regret. It was supposed to protect you. You were my friend. Friends don't destroy lives, Jonathan said quietly. Lightning flashed, illuminating Mark's face for heartbeat, guilt, fear, exhaustion all tangled together. Then a gunshot cracked through the thunder. Mark's eyes went wide. He staggered, clutching his side, and collapsed. Grace screamed. Jonathan turned and saw a shadow retreating through the back door, rain pouring in behind it. Whoever they were, they had just silenced their own man. Jonathan knelt beside Mark, pressing his hand against the wound. Stay with me. Mark's voice was faint. Get the twins out, find the files, it's all in the... He never finished. Jonathan looked up at Grace, their faces lit by flashes of lightning. We end this tonight, he said. Hours later, the truth came out. The encrypted files, hidden in Jonathan's private archives, revealed everything. The board's falsified documents, the payments to silence victims, the conspiracy to frame him as the scapegoat. Grace stood beside him as the police took statements, her face streaked with rain and tears. The twins slept upstairs, unaware of the chaos below. When it was over, Jonathan looked out at the dawn breaking over the soaked city. I built all this on lies, he said softly. Grace touched his arm. Then build something better. He turned to her. And you? I never came here to destroy you, she said. I came to find peace for my brother. I think I found it. Their eyes met. Two people bound by loss, betrayal, and something fragile that might one day become forgiveness. As the first rays of sunlight spilled into the broken mansion, Jonathan whispered, maybe truth was the only thing worth losing everything for. The wind carried his words away, leaving only silence. The kind that follows when everything false finally burns to ash. The sun rose slowly that morning, its light fractured through the broken glass panes of the mansion's windows. The storm had passed, but its echo still clung to the walls, the smell of rain, the faint hum of silence after chaos. Jonathan stood alone in the study, the very room where it had all begun. Papers lay scattered across the floor, remnants of the night's battle, contracts, letters, and the files that had almost destroyed him. He picked one up, smoothing the damp edges with trembling fingers. It was the report from the Dubai site, dated 3 years ago. His name printed neatly at the bottom, the same forged signature that had dragged him through hell. For years, he had buried that night in the back of his mind, convincing himself that silence was survival. Now he saw what that silence had cost. The twins' laughter echoed faintly from upstairs, light innocent, unscarred. That sound was the only thing keeping him standing. Grace entered quietly, her step soft, uncertain. She no longer wore her maid's uniform. She had changed into a simple sweater and jeans. The mask was gone. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was strength in them too, the kind that comes from finally facing the truth. "They've taken Mark's body," she said softly. "The police are still outside, but they'll leave soon." Jonathan nodded. He didn't look up. "I didn't want it to end like this." Grace stepped closer. "Neither did I. But sometimes truth demands a price." He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest pressing down until it hurt. "He was my friend, Grace. I trusted him more than anyone." "I think he did care about you," she said quietly. "He just cared about protecting himself more." Jonathan turned then, his eyes tired, hollowed out, but clear for the first time in years. "That's what I've been doing too, protecting myself. My image, my business, my comfort. All while people like your brother lost everything because of what I refused to see." Grace shook her head gently. "You didn't light that fire, Jonathan." "No," he said, voice low, "but I let it burn." They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the early light spilled across the marble floor, turning the wreckage golden. It was strange how beauty always seemed to return after destruction, like it was part of the balance. Light insisting on surviving even when everything else failed. Jonathan walked to the desk and picked up a photograph himself, Mark, and his late wife Emily, taken years ago during a company gala. Back then, his smile had been effortless, the kind that came from ignorance rather than peace. "I built this empire thinking money could erase guilt," he murmured, "but all it did was bury it deeper." Grace's voice was soft but firm. "Maybe this is your chance to start again, not as a billionaire, not as a name on a tower, but as a man who finally sees the difference between success and worth." Jonathan looked at her. There was no bitterness in her tone, only quiet understanding. "And you? What will you do now?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window. "There's a small school for deaf children near the coast. Sarah's been teaching me sign language. She said she'd help. I think I'd like to work there. Maybe help other kids like her brother who never got the chance to be." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "He'd be proud of you." She met his eyes. "I hope so." They stood there for a while, watching the morning unfold. It was the first calm they'd shared without the shadow of lies between them. Then Jonathan spoke again, his tone quieter, more contemplative. "You know what's strange? I spent my whole life trying to build something permanent. Towers, companies, investments. But all it took was one fire to show me that permanence is an illusion. The only real things we leave behind are the truths we face and the people we save because of them." Grace smiled faintly, though tears glistened in her eyes. "That's redemption, isn't it?" He nodded. "If such a thing exists." She took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. "It does. You just have to live like you believe it." For the first time in days, Jonathan felt a quiet peace wash through him. Not relief, not forgiveness, but acceptance. The kind that hurts before it heals. By afternoon, the police were gone, and the mansion was silent once more. Jonathan sat at his desk, typing the final lines of a statement. He had decided to go public, not with a defensive speech or a carefully polished press release, but with the truth. He wrote, "I once believed that silence protected the innocent. I know now it only protects the guilty. The men who died in Dubai deserve more than my regret. They deserve justice, and so do their families. I was blind and my blindness cost lives. This ends today." He signed his name, his real signature, at the bottom, not the forged one that had defined him for years. When he finished, he printed the statement, folded it neatly, and placed it in a sealed envelope marked for the press. Grace appeared in the doorway again. "You're sure about this?" "Yes," he said. "If the truth ruins me, so be it. Maybe that's what needs to happen." She studied him for a long moment. "You've changed." He gave a small, tired smile. Maybe I just started listening. She stepped forward and handed him a small pendant, silver, simple, and worn. It was my brother's, she said. I think he'd want you to have it. Not as forgiveness, but as a reminder to keep being the man you were tonight. He accepted it with both hands, his throat tight. Thank you. As she turned to leave, he called out softly, Grace? She paused. You were the only honest thing in this house, he said, even when you were lying. Her smile was sad but warm. Maybe honesty just needed a reason to show up. Then she was gone. That night, after the twins were asleep, Jonathan walked through the empty halls, stopping by the nursery. He watched them for a moment, small, peaceful, untouched by the storms of adults. Sarah's hand rested protectively on her brother's arm. He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I promise, he whispered, you'll grow up in a house where truth isn't something we hide from. Outside, the wind had gone still. The moonlight touched the wet grass, silver and clean, as if the earth itself had been washed new. Jonathan stood there for a long time, feeling the stillness settle in, the kind of stillness that comes not from absence, but from understanding. He thought of Mark's final words, Grace's courage, the men who had died unseen. And he realized something that would stay with him forever. Guilt could destroy a man, but facing it could rebuild him. Slowly, painfully, honestly, he walked back to the study, the pendant warm in his palm. As he placed it beside the photo of his family, he whispered to the empty room, For every truth I ignored, I'll tell 100 more. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not haunted, not hollow, just honest. So, tell me, if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.